Welcome to Rain Narrator channel where we take you on a journey of deep relaxation and complete tranquility with the sound of raindrops adding an atmosphere of tranquility and comfort. Relax, enjoy, and prepare to enter the world of dreams. If you are looking for an ideal way to relax or calm your mind before sleep, you are in the right place. Follow us to get the best stories. I had always been the quiet type, a little unsure of myself, living life in the shadows. Then she came into my world, a whirlwind of light and energy that I couldn't quite understand but felt drawn to. Her name was Lena, and she was everything I had ever imagined love to be. Beautiful, charismatic, and seemingly kind. From the moment I laid eyes on her, something clicked inside me. I was mesmerized by her presence. The way she smiled, the way her laughter sounded like music to my ears. It was as if the universe had created her just for me. I had never felt that way about anyone before, and soon I found myself falling for her in ways I never thought possible. At first, it felt like a dream. She made me feel special, like I was the only one who mattered. She would text me sweet messages, call me when I was feeling down, and always find ways to lift my spirits. I couldn't help but believe that this was real love, that I had finally found someone who understood me, who truly cared about me. I was so in love with her that I ignored the small signs. She would tell me about her big dreams, how she wanted to be successful, how she wanted to travel the world and make a name for herself. I admired her ambition, and I made it my mission to support her in every way I could. If she needed help with something, I was there. If she needed encouragement, I gave it. And in return, she would shower me with affection, making me believe that my efforts meant something to her. But as time passed, I started noticing something different. It wasn't in the way she treated me, not at first. No, it was in the way she started talking about her future, her plans, her ambitions. They became the center of everything. I would listen to her talk about her goals, and I would feel proud to be by her side, to support her. Yet there was always a sense that I wasn't really part of her vision. I was there in the background offering my support, but I was never truly in her future. It wasn't until one evening that the truth began to dawn on me. Lena had been accepted into a prestigious program overseas. It was everything she had dreamed of. This was her big break, the chance to achieve everything she had ever wanted. She called me that night, and the excitement in her voice was undeniable. I was happy for her, of course, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. She had always talked about how much she loved me, how much I meant to her, yet now I was just a spectator to her success. As the weeks passed, things began to change. I noticed that she would spend more time with people who could help her advance in her career. There was a particular man who seemed to always be around, an older, wealthy businessman who had the connections she needed. I tried not to let jealousy consume me, but it was hard not to feel like I was losing her bit by bit. One day, I overheard a conversation between Lena and this man. I wasn't supposed to be listening, but I couldn't help myself. They were discussing her future, and I heard her say, "I need to secure this position. If I do this, I'll be set for life. The guy I'm with is nice and all, but he doesn't have the connections or the resources I need. He's just a means to an end." I froze. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. All the love, all the care, all the attention she had given me, it wasn't real. I was just a stepping stone in her journey, a means to an end. I had spent months pouring my heart into someone who never really saw me, who never truly loved me for who I was, but rather for what I could do for her. The next day, she called me asking to meet. I was already numb, the realization of what she had said hanging heavily in my chest. When we sat down, she was still smiling, still radiating the same charm that had first drawn me in. But now I could see through it. I could see the calculation in her eyes. She told me that she was grateful for everything I had done for her, but that she needed to move on. She needed to focus on her goals, and that I was holding her back. It was as if I had been nothing more than a stepping stone to her. Success, a temporary companion, useful only until she had achieved what she wanted. "I'm sorry, but I've outgrown this relationship," she said, her voice soft, but there was no emotion behind it. "I think you understand." And just like that, she was gone. I sat there in silence, the weight of her words pressing down on me. I had been so sure that our love was real, that we had something special. But in the end, I was just a tool. The person I had loved, the one who had made me feel like I was the center of her world, was using me to climb higher, to reach her dreams. And now that she was where she wanted to be, I no longer had any value. I spent weeks in a haze trying to process the truth. I couldn't understand how I had been so blind, how I had allowed myself to fall for someone who only saw me as a means to an end. But as painful as it was, I realized something important. I had to learn from this. I couldn't allow myself to be used again. I had to find the strength to move on, to stop seeing love through rose-colored glasses and start seeing it for what it truly was. I learned that love should never be conditional. It should never be about what someone can do for you, but about who they are. I had loved Lena with all my heart, but in the end, she had never truly loved me back. She had loved the idea of me, the person who could help her achieve her dreams. Now I know better, and while I'll always carry the scars of that relationship, I'll also carry the lesson. True love isn't about ambition or what someone can provide for you. It's about connection, mutual respect, and unconditional support. It's hard to explain what happened. Sometimes you don't see things coming, and other times you just ignore the signs. But when you're in love, it's easy to convince yourself that everything is fine, that things will always stay the way they are. I guess I thought that too, but then everything changed. I met Mia when we were in high school. I was the quiet, awkward kid who kept to himself, and she was the kind of person who walked into a room and made everything brighter. She had this way about her, an infectious laugh, the way she always made you feel like you mattered, like you were seen. I don't know if it was fate or just coincidence, but from the moment I saw her, I felt this pull, like maybe she was the one I could spend forever with. We started hanging out more, studying together, talking about the silliest things that didn't matter to anyone else, but meant everything to us. Our friendship turned into something more, something that neither of us could ignore. She became my world. Her presence in my life was like a soft, warm blanket on a cold day. I loved her more than anything, and she loved me too. At least that's what I thought. Time passed, and we went off to college, still together. People told us that relationships in college rarely last, that we'd grow apart. But we were different, or so I thought. We made it work. We shared late-night talks, dreamt about the future, laughed about stupid things that happened during the day. We had plans to move into a little apartment together, travel the world, build a life. It felt so simple, so perfect. We were young, but we knew what we wanted, right? But somewhere along the way, things started to shift. It was gradual at first. Little things I brushed off because I didn't want to admit there was a problem. She'd be distant sometimes, not as excited to see me when I came over, not as eager to talk about the future. I tried to convince myself it was just the stress of college, that we were both figuring things out. I mean, I was no saint either. I'd get caught up in my own world, my own thoughts. But Mia was different. There was a guy. His name was Luke. He was in one of her classes, and at first I didn't think much of it. He was funny, confident, the kind of guy people were drawn to. But it wasn't until I noticed the little things, how Mia would smile at him in that way she used to smile at me, how she'd laugh at his jokes a little too much, how she'd get quiet whenever I asked about him, that I started to feel something was off. I ignored it. I convinced myself it was just a friendship, that I had nothing to worry about. But deep down I knew. I could feel it even if she didn't say it outright. Mia was pulling away from me inch by inch, and I was too afraid to confront it. It was one rainy evening when everything changed. Mia came over to my apartment, her eyes a little too bright, her lips pressed together like she was holding something back. She sat down beside me, but it didn't feel the same. There was this distance, this invisible wall that had formed between us, and I could feel it closing in. My heart was already beating faster, knowing what was coming. She looked at me, and for the first time in years, I didn't see that sparkle in her eyes. "I think we need to talk," she said, her voice softer than usual. I already knew what she was going to say. "I've met someone," she continued, her words like a punch to my gut. "Luke, I think I'm in love with him." The world seemed to freeze. It was like time had stopped, and I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I didn't want to hear it, didn't want to believe it. I wanted to shout, to beg her not to leave me, but I knew I couldn't. I loved her, and I had to respect her decision no matter how much it hurt. You love him?" I whispered, my voice trembling. I didn't know if I wanted her to confirm it or deny it. I just wanted the pain to go away. She nodded, tears welling in her eyes. I'm sorry. I never meant for this to happen. I didn't want to hurt you, but I can't keep pretending. I remember the way my chest felt like it was collapsing in on itself. All those years, all the memories, all the plans, they didn't mean anything anymore. At least not to her. I felt like I was losing a part of myself. A part of me that I had been so sure would never go away. I don't know what to say, I choked out. The words didn't come. I just sat there staring at the woman I thought I would spend my life with, feeling like she was slipping away from me, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. She reached for my hand, but I pulled away. I didn't want to hold on anymore. I didn't want to beg her to stay. Maybe that's what had been wrong for so long. I had been holding on so tightly, and now I had to let go. I'm sorry, she said again, her voice breaking. But I didn't need her apology. What good was it now? What good was any of it? I had loved her, and she had loved me, but it wasn't enough anymore. She stood up, wiping the tears from her eyes, and I could see her heart breaking too. I think she felt it just as much as I did, but it didn't change anything. Sometimes love isn't enough. Sometimes you can give everything and still lose it. I'll always care about you, she said, her voice barely a whisper, and then she left. I don't know how long I sat there after she left, in the silence, trying to figure out how to breathe without her. The person I thought I would always have by my side was gone, and it hurt in ways I didn't think were possible. I spent months trying to move on, trying to piece myself back together, but it was hard. Some days I would wake up and think it was all just a bad dream, that she would walk through the door and everything would be fine again. But the truth was, Mia had moved on, and I had to find a way to do the same. Maybe one day I'll be able to look back and smile at the memories we made. Maybe one day I'll understand why things happened the way they did. But for now, I'm just trying to heal, to find myself again, and to accept that love doesn't always last forever, no matter how hard you try to hold on to it. I suppose it all starts with her eyes. The first time I saw her, I was struck. The world around me vanished, just her and that look. I knew deep down I was never the same after that. She was unlike anyone I'd ever met. Her smile contagious, her laugh something that made the air feel lighter. But it wasn't just her beauty. No, it was her spirit, her kindness, and the way she looked at life with such unyielding hope. In a world so dark, she was my light. I wasn't supposed to fall for her. We were from different worlds. She was everything I wasn't, rich, respected, admired. I was the quiet guy with little to offer. My family struggled, and we lived in a small apartment, barely making ends meet. But when I saw her, I knew I would do anything to make her happy. She deserved the world, and I would give it to her. For months, I worked relentlessly, taking every odd job I could find. I was willing to sacrifice my every ounce of energy to get closer to her, to prove that I was worthy. I started saving money, thinking of ways to impress her. But it was never about the material things. It was about showing her that my love for her was genuine, that I was someone she could depend on. She had so many people around her, friends, admirers, and those who would bend over backward to get her attention. I didn't have any of that. All I had was my heart, and I poured it into her. I remember the first time we went out together, just the two of us. I took her to a small cafe on the corner of the street. It wasn't fancy, but it was special. She looked at me with such sweetness, as if she could see through the surface, and she was okay with it. Her eyes, full of curiosity and warmth, made me feel like I could finally breathe. As we talked, I realized that she saw me. Not the guy trying to fit in, not the guy with barely enough to his name, but me. Just me. I thought that maybe this was it. Maybe I was worthy. As time passed, our connection deepened. I watched her smile, and my heart swelled with pride. I was proud of her, proud of everything she stood for. But the more I fell, the more I saw my own weaknesses. Her world was full of opportunities, of places I couldn't reach, of things I couldn't offer. And I kept trying. I worked harder. I pushed myself further. I sacrificed everything, my health, my time, my own dreams, just to be the person she needed. I thought if I could just keep going, I'd eventually become someone she could never forget. And then, there was that night. She was quiet, distant. Something in her eyes changed, and I knew something was wrong. I asked her, and she hesitated. The words that came out of her mouth shattered me in ways I can't explain. "You're not enough for me." She didn't say it in a cruel way. It wasn't the words that hurt, but the truth behind them. She had changed. She had grown, evolved in ways I couldn't keep up with. She needed someone more like her, a person who could understand her world, who could offer the things I simply couldn't. I thought, maybe it's just a phase. I thought maybe I can fix this. But deep down I knew that my sacrifices had never been enough to change the fact that we were too different. She found someone else, someone who could give her everything I couldn't. At first, I didn't understand it. I thought, but I gave everything for you. I put my heart and soul into us. But she had already made up her mind. She betrayed me in the way only someone you love can. What hurt the most wasn't that she chose someone else. It was that in the end, my love wasn't enough. I realized then, all the things I had given up, my time, my energy, my life were never going to make me the person she needed. I wasn't her equal. I was just a stepping stone, someone who was there when she needed me, but not the one she truly wanted. I left, trying to pick up the pieces of what was left of me. I remember the last time I saw her standing there, her back to me, walking away with someone else. The feeling that washed over me wasn't anger or bitterness, it was acceptance. The truth was that I had always been fighting an uphill battle. I had been in love with an idea of her, an idea of what we could be. But we weren't right for each other. And as much as it hurt, I had to let go. The hardest part was realizing that love, no matter how deep, wasn't enough to bridge the gap between who we were. I could sacrifice everything, but it would never change the fact that we were two people traveling in different directions. She needed someone who could match her energy, her ambitions, and I couldn't do that. The betrayal didn't come from her choosing someone else. It came from realizing that even after everything, she didn't truly see me as her equal, and maybe I didn't see myself as that either. I loved her. I gave her everything. But sometimes love isn't enough. Sometimes it takes more than just sacrifice. It takes two people who can walk the same path, not just someone who's willing to carry the weight of it all alone. I'll always love her, and I'll always cherish the moments we shared. But in the end, I learned the painful truth. Love doesn't always mean forever, and sacrifice doesn't always lead to happiness. And so I walk away, carrying the lessons, the pain, and the hope that someday I'll find a love that isn't about sacrifice but about balance. A love where both hearts are equal, where both can walk side by side, not one pulling the other along. It all started in high school. I remember the first time I noticed her. Her name was Mia. She was a year ahead of me, and she was this quiet, pretty girl who always seemed to have her nose buried in a book. At the time, I wasn't paying attention to anything more than my own world, so I never really thought much of her. But one day we had to do a group project in English class. I remember being paired up with her, and honestly, I was a little nervous. I hadn't spoken to her before, but I knew she was smart, and I didn't want to look like a fool. When we first met outside the classroom to work on our project, we barely exchanged more than a few words, but something about her calmness, the way she listened without interrupting, stuck with me. We didn't really connect during high school. She was always surrounded by her friends, and I had my own crowd. But it wasn't until after graduation when we started to cross paths more regularly. I'd run into her occasionally at the local coffee shop or at the library, and one day, we happened to bump into each other while walking home. She'd always been a few steps ahead of me, but that day we ended up walking the same way. Turns out we were neighbors, just a few blocks apart. She laughed when she found out how close we lived to each other. We could have been walking to school together all these years, she said, her smile easy and warm. We started talking more after that. At first, it was just casual conversation about classes, our summer plans, the books we were reading. We started taking the same route home after school, stopping by the same coffee shop almost every day. But slowly, something shifted. I wasn't just talking to her because we were neighbors or because we both enjoyed a good latte. I started looking forward to seeing her, hearing her voice. We would talk about everything, but sometimes I didn't even realize how much I had opened up to her until I'd already said it. I guess she had this way of making me feel safe. Then life got a little more complicated. We both went to different universities. She chose one in the city while I stayed closer to home. I didn't expect much to change. It seemed like the end of one chapter, but I didn't think it would be the end of us. However, the distance was harder to deal with than I thought. We both had busy schedules, and there were days when I didn't hear from her for a while. That distance, it did something to me. I felt this longing to know how she was doing, to be around her. I knew something was changing between us, but I didn't know what it meant. I hadn't realized how deeply I had fallen for her. One night during the winter break, I ran into Mia at a local bookstore. She had her arms full of books, as always, her eyes scanning the shelves. When she saw me, she waved and smiled like nothing had ever changed. "You still reading all these books?" I asked, teasing her. "Of course," she replied, raising an eyebrow. "You know I can't resist." I smiled, but there was something different in the air between us now. It felt like something was just waiting to be said, but neither of us was ready to say it. We talked about our university life, the challenges we were facing, but the conversation kept drifting back to what had happened over the past few months. The long pauses, the unspoken words, the moments when we almost reached out but didn't. That night, after we said goodbye outside the bookstore, I walked her to her car. The street was quiet, with snowflakes gently falling around us. As we stopped at her car, she turned to me, her face serious now. "I've missed you," she said softly. Those words hit me harder than I expected. "I've missed you too." And that's when it happened. I had always been afraid of saying the wrong thing, afraid of crossing that line, but suddenly it didn't matter. I wanted to be honest with her. "Mia, I think I've always missed you. Even before we went to different universities," I said, feeling my heart pounding. "I didn't realize how much I cared about you until we were apart. And now I can't stop thinking about you." Her expression softened and she stepped closer, her breath visible in the cold air. "I feel the same way," she whispered, barely audible. I could feel the world around us slowing down. We stood there for a moment, just looking at each other, neither of us knowing exactly what came next, but somehow it didn't matter. All I knew was that this felt right, and I didn't want to let her go again. From that night on, things between us changed. We started spending more time together, talking more, being more open with each other. Our connection deepened in a way that felt so natural, like we had always been meant to be this close. We'd drive around the city on weekends, or spend hours at coffee shops, talking about everything and nothing at all. There was a quiet kind of comfort with her that I had never known before. I realized somewhere along the way that she wasn't just the girl from high school or the girl who lived a few blocks away. She was my best friend, the person I wanted to share everything with. And slowly, I started to understand that this wasn't just about being neighbors anymore. It was about wanting to be with her, to build something real together. We were both young, still figuring things out, but somehow, being together felt like the most certain thing in the world. We had been through so much already, even though we hadn't known it at the time. Now it felt like we were finally on the same page, and in that moment, I realized that I didn't need anything more than this. I didn't need a fancy proposal or grand gestures. All I needed was to be with her because I knew deep down she was the one. And from that day forward, we never looked back. It's funny, isn't it? How you can leave a place with one vision in your head, but when you return, it's all different. I've spent years in another country, pushing myself through a maze of textbooks and exams, forcing myself to grow into the man I thought I should be. But the truth is, I never stopped thinking about her, Sophia. When I left, I was just a boy, eager, nervous, uncertain. I was a mess, really. The kind of mess that thought he had all the time in the world. I thought, I'll go, I'll learn, and then I'll come back. I imagined that when I returned, everything would be like I left it. The same dusty roads, the same warm air in the summer, the same girl with that bright smile and innocent laugh. She was my world back then. I remember the last day before I left. She stood by the gates of the old school, her eyes glistening with tears she never wanted to show. I never understood that, even though I should have. I held her hand, told her I'd be back, but we both knew that wasn't true. People change, time changes, and distance stretches things thin. I spent all those years building a new life, in a new city, a new country with new people. I studied hard, did things I never thought I'd do, learned things I never thought I'd learn. Yet every night when I laid my head down, it was her face I saw, her smile, the way she'd tilt her head when she was curious about something, how she laughed when something caught her off guard. I still had that image in my mind, but it was just that, an image frozen in time. Then a few months ago, I got a call from home. My father said it was time to come back. Things have changed, he said, but it's time. And I didn't know it then, but that was the moment everything was about to change. The first thing I noticed when I arrived was the town. It had grown in a way. New buildings, new stores, but somehow it still had that same warm, dusty air. I walked through the streets and it was like nothing had changed. But everything had. And then I saw her, Sophia. It took me a moment to recognize her. She was standing outside the cafe where we used to meet after school, talking to someone, a man I didn't know. But it wasn't just the man that caught my attention. It was her, the way she stood, her back straight, her arms crossed confidently over her chest. She wasn't the same girl I remembered. The girl I once knew had been replaced by someone stronger, fiercer. She turned and saw me, her eyes softening for just a split second before a mask of composure settled over her face. I could see it, the layers that had been built over the years, over the time I'd been gone. She wasn't a girl anymore. She was a woman who had lived a life, made decisions, taken risks. I walked up to her, unsure of what to say. My voice felt foreign in my own throat. "Sophia," I said, trying to sound casual, but even I could hear the tremor in my voice. She smiled, but it wasn't the smile I remembered. It was warm but guarded. She shook her head as if she couldn't quite believe. I was standing there in front of her. "You came back," she said softly, almost as if testing the words. "I'm back," I replied. There was a long pause. The world seemed to slow down as we just stood there staring at each other. All the years, all the changes, the distance, and it all felt like a wall between us. "You've changed," she said finally, her voice steady, with no sign of the girl who used to get flustered around me. She had become someone I didn't recognize, but I knew her somehow. I could see the remnants of the girl I had loved in the way her eyes held secrets, in the lines of her face, but the way she stood before me now told me that she had grown, and that the girl I left behind no longer needed me. "You've changed too," I replied. It was all I could think to say. "I had to," she said, and there was no bitterness in her words, just truth. "You know, when you left, I thought I would just wait. That's what we did, right? We were supposed to wait for each other. But I didn't, I couldn't. You were so sure of your future, and I was just left here, so I made my own. And there it was." She didn't just wait for me. She didn't hold on to some idea of us that I had left behind in my absence. She had become who she needed to be without me. Strong, independent, I realized. Then that all the time I spent dreaming of coming back to the girl I once knew was just that, a dream. She had built herself a new life without me in it. We talked for hours that afternoon. We laughed about old memories, shared things we'd never said before, and yet we both knew the truth. The girl I had loved was still there, somewhere, but she had become something more than I ever could have imagined. And the man I had hoped to be was still finding his way back home. There were no grand declarations, no promises of forever. But in that moment, as the sun set over the town, I realized that maybe that was okay. Sometimes love isn't about holding on to what you had. It's about recognizing what someone has become and respecting the space between the person you once knew and the person they are now. I don't know what will happen between us, but I do know this. No matter how far I traveled, no matter how many years passed, the love I had for Sophia didn't fade. It evolved. And maybe that's what love is supposed to do. Evolve, grow, and meet you where you are. It all started on a trip. Not the kind of extravagant vacation you'd imagine. No, just a simple backpacking adventure. I had no destination in mind, just wanted to see the world, stretch my legs, and find some adventure along the way. It was a mild autumn day when I first saw her. I remember it clearly, not because it was the start of something so monumental, but because at that moment, she was just a stranger in a crowd of faces, another traveler at a quaint little cafe in the middle of nowhere. I wasn't looking for anything, more than a decent cup of coffee and a quiet spot to read, but she was sitting across from me at the corner table. I was about to pick up my book when I overheard her laugh, a soft sound, like the wind brushing through leaves. It caught my attention and my eyes drifted to her. She was sitting with a map spread across the table, frowning at it, biting her lip in a way that was both thoughtful and a little frustrated. Something about that moment, her quiet determination, drew me in. I didn't mean to stare, but there was just something about her. Her dark hair tied loosely into a messy bun, the way her brown eyes seemed to search for something in the world, like she wasn't quite sure what she was looking for, but she was determined to find it. "Excuse me," I found myself saying before I could stop it. "Can I help you with the map? Looks like you're trying to figure something out." She looked up, startled, and then smiled. A warm smile that melted the air around us. Oh, that's kind of you. I'm trying to find the right path to the next town over. The maps here are not as reliable as I hoped. I don't know what made me offer, but I said, I've been around this area a bit. If you don't mind the company, maybe I can show you the way. She looked at me for a long moment, her eyes curious, searching, before she nodded. Why not? And so we ended up walking together. Her name was Emily. She was a writer. She told me traveling alone, looking for inspiration for her next book. I wasn't sure what I was doing. I wasn't much of a traveler by design, more of a guy who just stumbled into places. But there was something about Emily that made me feel like I should stick around. We talked as we walked, and the more we spoke, the more I found myself drawn to her. The strange thing, though, was the ease between us. It wasn't forced or awkward. It felt natural, like we'd known each other for years. The way she described the places she'd been, the way her eyes sparkled when she spoke of her favorite stories, made me feel like I was seeing the world through her eyes. We shared stories, laughed at random things, and at one point, I realized we were both walking without any real destination in mind. We were simply enjoying each other's company. By the end of that day, we parted ways, she to her hotel and I to mine. But I knew something had shifted. A connection had been made, even if I couldn't quite define it at the time. The next year, I was on the road again. I hadn't planned to go to the same place, but somehow there I was, sitting in the same cafe, with the same book in hand. I remember the moment I saw her again, standing by the door as if she was meant to walk in at that exact moment. She wasn't the same as last time, though. She was more confident, her eyes brighter, her posture different, like she had found something in the world and in herself. Adam? Her voice was like a melody I hadn't realized I missed. Emily? I said, almost laughing in disbelief. We stood there for a moment, not sure whether to hug or just stare at each other like we'd both imagined this reunion. In the end, we did both. I didn't think I'd see you again, I said, grinning.
Are you following me?
She laughed, shaking her head. I didn't expect to be here, actually. I didn't think you'd come back to this place either. And there we were again, like two pieces of a puzzle that fit perfectly. We talked for hours, catching up on everything. Somehow, as the evening drew to a close, we found ourselves walking the same path we'd walked the year before. It felt like no time had passed. It wasn't until the third year that we both realized something we hadn't put into words before. Every time we crossed paths, it felt like a thread pulling us closer. The same cafe, the same streets, the same quiet walks. It wasn't just coincidence. It was destiny, or maybe fate, or just the universe trying to tell us something. We didn't plan it. But every year we found ourselves meeting again in the same place, in the same way. Each year we grew a little closer, learned a little more about each other. I'd never been someone who believed in love at first sight, but I could no longer deny it. Emily had become part of my life in a way I couldn't explain. By the fourth year, I was no longer just meeting her by chance. I was coming to meet her, knowing deep down that our paths had aligned for a reason. We'd grown together, shared so much of our lives, and I'd finally admitted what I'd been too afraid to say before. I took a deep breath one evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, and I told her, Emily, I think I've fallen for you. She smiled, her eyes warm with understanding. I've been waiting for you to say that. Now, years later, we still meet in that same place every year, as if it's where everything began and where everything comes full circle. We travel to new places, explore different parts of the world, but we always come back here, to this one spot where everything changed. I sometimes wonder if we're meant to keep meeting here, over and over again, or if it's the world's way of telling us we found something worth holding on to. I guess we'll never know for sure, but I do know one thing. I'll never stop showing up in that cafe every year, because every year I get to see Emily again, and every year I fall in love with her all over again. So yeah, that's how it happened. A simple meeting on a travel trip turned into something so much more. Not a story of grand gestures, not a story of fate that we couldn't change, but a story of two people finding each other in the same place year after year, discovering together that maybe the greatest adventure of all was the love we were building between us, one trip at a time. I want a love story about a young man and a young woman. A young man loves a girl from afar, but finds himself forced to help her solve a personal problem. Explain the story to me as if the young man was speaking. I want a long story. My name is Kian, and I live in the village of Iran. It's a quiet place nestled on the edge of a vast forest, where the air smells of pine and the rivers hum a gentle tune as they flow past our homes. We've lived by the same customs and traditions for generations. The elders, wise as they may be, have always told us how things should be, who we should marry, where we should work, how we should live. There is another village just over the hill. It's called Valen, and though it's not far from Erin, it might as well have been a world away. They have their own traditions, their own way of doing things. For as long as I can remember, there was always an unspoken understanding between the two villages. We don't mix. Marriages are arranged, and they are always within the same village. Our families never interact with theirs, but there was something about that village that always intrigued me. Maybe it was the whispers I'd hear when the wind carried the sound of their music, or the rare moments I'd catch glimpses of their women, walking down the road with baskets on their heads, faces hidden behind veils, but I didn't think much about it. I was content with my life, content with the path set out for me. That is, until the day I met her. Her name is Lyra. I first saw her at the market, though I didn't know who she was at the time. My father had sent me to Erin's marketplace to buy some grain, and as I was haggling with the merchant, I noticed her standing by the fruit stall. There was something in the way she stood, so still and graceful, almost like she didn't belong in a place like that. The sight of her caught my attention in a way I couldn't explain. The way the sunlight danced in her dark hair, the way her eyes scanned the marketplace, always looking, always searching. But what truly captivated me was the soft smile she gave to the old man selling apples. It was a smile that felt rare, genuine. I had never seen a woman like her. I had never seen anyone like her. The next few days passed in a blur. I couldn't get her out of my mind. I wondered who she was, where she came from, why she was in our village. I spent far too much time thinking about the girl I had never spoken to, when I knew I should be focused on my work. My father had been reminding me more and more about the importance of finding a suitable match, a woman from our village. But that was the last thing on my mind. Then one evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I saw her again. It was a full moon that night, and the village square was lively, with people dancing and playing music. As I made my way to the edge of the gathering, I saw her standing by the fountain, her gaze lost in the shimmering moonlight. She wasn't with anyone, just standing there looking out across the water, as if waiting for something, someone. I couldn't help myself. I walked up to her, my heart pounding in my chest. "It's a beautiful night, isn't it?" I said, my voice shaking. She turned to me, and for the briefest of moments her eyes locked with mine. I saw curiosity there and perhaps a bit of surprise. Then she smiled, a smile that made everything feel brighter. "Yes, it is," she replied, her voice soft but steady. "I don't think I've seen you here before," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. She nodded slowly. "I'm from Valen. I've come to visit someone." I froze. Valen, the village we were forbidden to mix with. The village where the rules were as rigid as the stones lining the riverbanks. I should have walked away. I should have kept my distance. But something in me, something I couldn't explain, made me stay. "Do you visit often?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. She shook her head. "No, this is my first time." I don't know what made me speak next, but I did. "I'm Kian," I said, offering her a smile. "From Erin." She smiled back, her eyes twinkling in the moonlight. "I'm Lyra." It was a simple exchange, but in that moment, it felt like the universe had opened up before me. The sound of the music and laughter from the village square faded into the background. All I could hear was the beating of my heart. All I could see was her. "I never expected to meet someone from Valen," I said, almost to myself. "I never thought I'd meet someone from Erin," she replied. "But I'm glad I did." We talked for a while longer that night. We spoke of our villages, of the quiet life we both led, and of the traditions that kept us bound to our separate worlds. She told me of her life in Valen, how she had always felt confined by the expectations placed on her as a woman there. I too confessed how I had grown weary of the expectations in Erin, how I longed for something more than the path that had been laid before me. As the night wore on, we found ourselves standing there facing the impossible. The distance between our two villages wasn't just physical, it was ingrained in the very fabric of our lives. If we were to continue, we would have to challenge the very traditions that had defined us. We would have to fight against the rules of our society. The rules that told us that love between our villages was impossible. The decision wasn't easy. Neither of us had ever known anything different. But in that moment, we both knew. We knew we couldn't walk away from what we felt. For the first time in my life, I felt truly alive, truly seen. And when Lyra looked at me, I saw the same in her eyes. We agreed to meet again. And so we did. We kept meeting secretly in places where no one could see us. We talked, laughed, shared dreams and fears. We spoke of a future where the walls between our villages didn't matter, where love didn't have to abide by old rules. Every stolen moment with her felt like a rebellion, but it was a rebellion that made me feel whole. We both knew that we couldn't keep living like this forever. So one fateful day, we decided to act. We gathered our courage, and together, we walked into the village square hand in hand. It felt like an eternity before the elders and the people saw us. Their gazes filled with shock and disbelief, but we stood together unashamed. We challenged the traditions that had kept us apart, not out of defiance, but out of love. Love that refused to be contained by borders. And in the end, our love was stronger than the divisions. Slowly, over time, others began to see that love wasn't something to be controlled. It wasn't something that belonged to one village or the other. It was something that belonged to everyone. Lyra and I made our way through the world together, challenging the old ways, embracing the new, and in doing so, we changed not only our lives, but the lives of everyone around us. So when I look back at that moment, the moment I first saw her standing by the fountain in the moonlight, I realized that sometimes the most important thing you can do in life is to challenge what you're told is impossible, to follow your heart even when the world says it can't be done. I never expected to find myself in this situation. It all started on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, when I saw her for the first time. Her name was Clara. She was new to the school, having moved here from another town, and though she didn't stand out in the way some of the other girls did, bright clothes, loud personalities, there was something about her that caught my eye. It wasn't her smile, though it was beautiful. It wasn't her hair, though it shimmered like golden silk. It was the way she carried herself, quiet, thoughtful, almost distant. I liked the idea of a girl who didn't try to fit in, who wasn't like all the others. I watched her for days, always from a distance, as she wandered the school grounds, her head tilted slightly as if she was lost in her own world. She didn't talk to anyone much. I didn't talk to her either. I didn't know how. I was one of those guys who believed in love from afar. I thought if I could keep my distance, if I could protect her from the messy reality of relationships, then it would remain pure in my heart. But that was before the day I found her crying. I had been walking to the library after class when I saw her by the back of the school. There she was, sitting on the ground, knees pulled to her chest, her head buried in her arms. She was sobbing softly, the sound breaking my heart in a way I didn't understand. I wasn't supposed to see her like this. I had no right to get involved in her life. I should have walked away, pretended I didn't see her. I was the kind of guy who stayed on the sidelines. But for some reason, I couldn't. I approached her cautiously. I wasn't sure what to say. I didn't know how to comfort someone who wasn't asking for comfort. But as I stood there, I couldn't help but ask, "Clara, are you okay?" She looked up, startled, her eyes red from crying. For a moment, I saw a flicker of something, fear, embarrassment, and maybe even relief all at once. She wiped her tears quickly, trying to hide them. But it was obvious she was struggling. "I'm fine," she said quickly, though her voice betrayed her. I didn't believe her. "You don't look fine," I said gently. "You don't have to pretend with me." She didn't respond right away. Instead, she just looked at me, as if trying to decide whether or not to let me in. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, she spoke. "I don't know how to explain it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's just, everything's falling apart. I don't know what to do anymore." I could see it in her eyes, the fear, the confusion. I wanted to walk away. I wanted to say that I couldn't help her. But for some reason, something inside me told me I had to stay, that I had to help her. "Can I help?" I asked, not knowing if I was crossing a line. "What's going on, Clara?" She hesitated, then, in a shaky voice, she started to tell me. She had a secret, one that she hadn't shared with anyone. Her family was struggling. Her father had lost his job a few months ago, and now they were facing eviction. The bills piled up, and she didn't know how to fix it. She couldn't talk to her friends about it. She didn't want anyone to pity her. The weight of it all had been wearing her down, and she hadn't been able to find a way to fix it. It was a problem far too big for a girl like her to carry alone. As she spoke, I found myself feeling something deep inside me, something I hadn't expected. I wasn't just feeling sympathy, I was feeling protective. It was like a switch had been flipped. I wanted to help her. I needed to help her. "Clara," I said softly, kneeling down so I was at eye level with her. "You don't have to carry this on your own." She looked at me, her eyes wide, uncertain. "But how could you help me? You don't even know what to do. No one can fix this." "I don't know exactly how," I admitted. "But I know this, I can be here for you. I can help you find a way. You're not alone in this." There was a long silence between us, and for the first time I saw a flicker of hope in her eyes, a small spark that had been buried beneath the weight of her troubles. Maybe I hadn't solved her problems yet, but for the first time, I felt like I had done something to make her feel seen, to make her feel like maybe things wouldn't always be this hard. Over the next few weeks, I found myself helping her in ways I hadn't anticipated. We spent hours researching ways she could help her family. I offered to talk to my parents about any possible connections, helped her search for local charities, and tried to be the support she so desperately needed. But it wasn't just about fixing her problems. It was about showing her that she wasn't invisible, that she didn't have to carry all of this weight alone. And in the process, I started to realize something I hadn't let myself admit before. I was falling in love with her. The more I helped her, the more I wanted to be close to her, to make sure she was okay. I loved the way her eyes lit up when we found a solution, the way she smiled shyly when I complimented her for being strong. She never asked for my love. She never knew how much I cared about her. I wasn't sure if she even felt the same way, but it didn't matter. I was just happy to be there for her, to be someone she could trust. The day she came to me with the news that things had finally started to turn around for her family, I saw something in her that made my heart swell with joy. She was smiling, really smiling, for the first time in weeks. The weight had lifted from her shoulders, and I knew that she had come through it stronger. And maybe, just maybe, we were both a little bit different now. "You helped me," she said, her voice steady and sincere. "I don't think I could have made it without you." I wanted to tell her everything. I wanted to tell her that I had fallen in love with her, that every moment we spent together had been more than just helping her with her problems. It had been the most meaningful part of my life. But instead, I just smiled and said, "You did all the hard work. I was just here for you when you needed it." She looked at me for a long moment, and I could see the change in her eyes. She knew. I wasn't sure how or when, but I felt like she knew everything I was too afraid to say. "I'm glad you were here," she whispered. "I don't think I'll ever forget it." I knew then that it didn't matter how long it would take, or whether I ever told her about the love I felt. The truth was, I had already been part of her life in a way that was more meaningful than anything else, and that, I realized, was enough. In the end, maybe love wasn't about grand gestures or declarations. Maybe it was just about being there when it mattered most, and that was a lesson I would never forget. It was a rainy Tuesday morning when I first saw her. The streets were slick with the storm, and the world seemed to move a little slower. I was running late, as usual, trying to get to the bus stop, my mind scattered with thoughts of the meeting I had that day. That's when I saw her. She was standing by the old coffee shop holding an umbrella, her dark hair damp and curling slightly from the rain. There was something about the way she stood, like she was waiting, but not for anything in particular. She had this quiet calm about her, a kind of peace that felt out of place in the rush of the city. Our eyes met for a moment. I don't know why, but I felt this sudden pull toward her. It was like we had always known each other. I had to say something, anything, so I walked over to her. "Excuse me, do you know if the bus is running late today?" I asked, sounding more flustered than I intended. She looked at me with a soft smile, her eyes bright even in the gloomy weather. "I'm not sure," she replied, her voice warm and gentle. "But it doesn't matter. I think sometimes we have to wait for the things we want, even if they don't come on time." I laughed, half in disbelief at how effortlessly she said it. She was so composed, so at ease with herself, while I felt like I was barely keeping my head above water. From that moment, I don't know what it was, but I wanted to know her. I didn't know her name or where she was from, but something in her words stuck with me. I kept thinking about her all day. I couldn't stop wondering who she was, what her life was like. The next day, I went to that same coffee shop. hoping for some strange miracle that I would see her again. As luck would have it, she was there. She was sitting by the window, a book in her lap, looking so absorbed in it that she didn't even notice me walk in. I ordered my coffee, and then I did something I never thought I would. I walked over to her. "Hi," I said, my voice a little unsure. She looked up from her book, and I saw that same smile I had remembered from the day before. "Oh, it's you," she said as if we were old friends. "You're the guy who asked about the bus." "That's me," I said, laughing nervously. "I didn't expect to see you here." She raised an eyebrow playfully. "I come here all the time. It's my favorite spot when I need a quiet place." "I could use a quiet place too," I admitted. And just like that, we started talking. About books, about life, about the things that made us happy, and the things that kept us up at night. It felt so natural, like we had always known each other, as though we were picking up a conversation that had been left unfinished years ago. I found out her name was Emma. She was a writer working on her first novel. She loved the rain, said it helped her think, helped her find the right words. She talked about her family, her travels, and how she had a tendency to get lost in the details. I couldn't get enough of her stories, of the way she spoke about the world like it was a big, beautiful puzzle. We started seeing each other more. At first it was just casual, coffee dates, walks in the park, spontaneous movie nights. But the more I got to know her, the more I realized I was falling for her. It wasn't just the way she laughed or how she always seemed to know what I needed even before I did. It was the way she made me feel like I was enough just as I was. She never tried to change me. She just accepted me for who I was. One evening, about 6 months after we met, we were sitting on her couch, watching a movie I had insisted on picking. It wasn't really her kind of film. She preferred dramas or something, more intellectual, but she didn't complain. We were wrapped in a blanket and I could feel her warmth beside me. I had been holding on to something for a while now, something I knew I couldn't keep hidden any longer. "Emma," I said, turning to face her. She looked at me with those wide, curious eyes. "I need to tell you something." Her smile faded a little and she sat up, her hands folding in her lap. "What is it?" I think I love you." The words came out simpler than I thought they would, but they felt right. She didn't speak right away. Instead, she looked at me, really looked at me as if she was deciding something important. Then slowly, she reached out and took my hand. "I love you too," she said. And in that moment, I swear I could have sworn the world stopped spinning. I didn't know how, I didn't know when, but somehow we had found each other. It wasn't all easy after that. We had our arguments, our moments of doubt, moments where we questioned whether we were doing the right thing. But every time we fell, we got back up. Every time we fought, we forgave each other. And through it all, we knew one thing. We wanted to be together. A year later, on a quiet Sunday morning, I took her to that same coffee shop where we'd met. The rain was pouring down, just like it had on that first day. She looked at me a little confused as I asked her to come outside with me. I led her to the steps of the coffee shop, and there, under the overhang, I knelt down. She gasped, her hands flying to her mouth in surprise. "Emma," I said, my voice trembling, "I don't want to spend another moment without you. Will you marry me?" Tears filled her eyes, and I saw the same smile that had made me fall in love with her. "Yes," she whispered, and I felt the weight of the world lift off my shoulders. And so we married in the spring, in a small ceremony surrounded by family and close friends. It wasn't extravagant, but it was perfect. I had the woman I loved by my side, and we were starting our new life together. Now, years later, I still look back on that rainy Tuesday, and I can't believe how one simple meeting turned into everything. We have our ups and downs, but with Emma, I know I'm exactly where I'm meant to be. Every day, I'm reminded that love doesn't have to be grand or complicated. It's just about finding the person who makes you feel like home, and I found that in her. I still remember the first time I saw her like it was yesterday. I was sitting at a corner table in the cafe, the one by the window, where I like to come every day after work. It was my escape. The hustle of the office always left me drained, and this place felt like my little slice of peace. The barista had just brought me my usual, a hot cup of coffee, and I was absorbed in my thoughts when the door chimed. She walked in, and for a moment, time seemed to freeze. She wasn't doing anything extraordinary, just standing there looking at the menu, but there was something about the way the light hit her face, the way her hair cascaded down her shoulders. She looked so effortlessly beautiful, like she belonged in a painting. My heart started to race and I quickly looked down at my cup, trying to calm myself. I was the type who never really took risks, never approached strangers, but something about her presence made me feel like maybe, just maybe, it was worth stepping out of my comfort zone. I watched her for a few more moments, wishing I could find the courage to speak up, but instead, I just sipped my coffee and pretended to read the newspaper. She ordered a cappuccino, and when she turned around to find a seat, our eyes met. It was brief, just a fleeting second, but it was enough to send a jolt through me. I couldn't look away, and neither could she. Her gaze lingered for a second longer than I expected, and for some reason that made me bolder. Before I could overthink it, I stood up. My heart was pounding so loudly I thought she'd hear it. I walked up to her, almost feeling like I was floating. She was still standing there, staring out the window, and I tapped her lightly on the shoulder. "Hi, I don't mean to interrupt," I said, my voice coming out a little shakier than I intended. But I couldn't help but notice. "You seem like someone I'd want to talk to." She turned to me, and for a second I could have sworn the world around us stopped. Her eyes were a warm brown, and they sparkled as if she was amused by my sudden, unexpected approach. "Hi," she replied with a soft smile. "You're not interrupting. It's nice to meet you. I'm Clara." "Clara," I repeated, trying to savor her name. It sounded perfect. "I'm Alex. I come here almost every day." "Me too," she said, sitting down at an empty table nearby. "It's my favorite spot." I sat across from her, not wanting to let the moment slip away. We talked for hours as if we had known each other for years. We shared stories, laughs, and slowly my initial nerves began to fade. She was easy to talk to, so open and warm, as if she'd been waiting for someone like me to come along. By the time the sun had set and the cafe was closing, I realized I didn't want the conversation to end. "Maybe we can do this again tomorrow?" I asked, hoping I wasn't being too forward. She smiled, her eyes lighting up. "I'd like that." Over the next few weeks, Clara and I spent almost every afternoon together at that cafe. We shared everything, our favorite books, our dreams, our fears. It felt like we were in our own little world, as if time didn't matter when we were together. I learned that she loved the ocean, that she had once wanted to be a painter but decided to pursue a career in writing instead. She told me about her childhood, how she had moved to the city from a small town, hoping to find something bigger than herself. For me, it was like discovering a part of myself that I didn't know was missing. With Clara, I felt free, like I could be my true self without any judgment. She was gentle and kind, but she also had this spark in her, this fire that made me want to be a better version of myself. One afternoon, as we were sitting on the park bench near the cafe, watching the leaves fall from the trees, she turned to me with a serious expression. "Alex," she said softly, "there's something I need to tell you." My heart skipped a beat. "What's wrong?" She hesitated for a moment, her fingers nervously playing with the hem of her jacket. "I'm moving away soon, to another city for a new job opportunity." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I hadn't expected this. I had known from the beginning that we were both just passing through each other's lives, but I hadn't wanted to acknowledge it. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my emotions in check. "When?" "In a few weeks." "I'm really sorry. I didn't want to tell you so soon, but it felt right." I took a deep breath. "Clara, I don't want you to go. I don't want this to end." Her eyes softened. "Alex, we don't know what's ahead, and I don't want to give you false hope. But what we have right now, these moments, they're real, and I'll carry them with me wherever I go." I stood up, trying to compose myself. I had always believed that love was something you could control, something that would fit neatly into your life. But now I realized love wasn't something you could plan. It was unpredictable, messy, and beautiful, and I didn't want to let go of something so beautiful just because of the unknown. "I'll miss you," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "I'll miss you too, Alex, but maybe we're not meant to be forever. Maybe we were just meant to show each other what it feels like to be truly seen." And that was it. She left and life moved on, but I never forgot her. I couldn't. Sometimes I still visit that cafe, hoping I might see her again. But I've come to realize that some people come into your life not to stay, but to teach you something important. For me, Clara taught me that love doesn't always have to last forever to be real. It can be fleeting, and still it can change you in ways you never expected. And now, whenever I meet someone new, I remember that feeling, that sense of being truly seen, and I try to carry it with me, because I know that love, even in its shortest form, is still love. I was 22 when I first saw her, Nina. It was a Sunday afternoon, and I was at a cafe I frequented to read and have some peace. I had always kept to myself, quiet, introverted. But that day when she walked in, everything changed. She had this energy, this kind of effortless grace that made me nervous just by being in the same room. I tried not to stare, but I couldn't help it. She sat by the window, her eyes glued to the book she was reading. But I noticed the way her hair caught the light, the way her lips curled into the smallest smile every now and then, even though she was alone. I spent the next hour trying to convince myself that I wasn't brave enough to talk to her, but the feeling was overwhelming. I walked up to her table, heart racing. "Excuse me," I said, trying to sound casual. "Is that book any good?" She looked up at me with those deep brown eyes, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. "Yeah, it's amazing," she said, her voice soft but clear. "You should read it." Her smile made my world shift, just a little bit. From that moment, everything felt different. We started talking more about books, music, life, everything. And over time, I found myself sharing pieces of myself I'd never told anyone. With Nina, it was easy. She never judged, never questioned. She just listened. The connection was instant. And as much as I tried to deny it, I started falling for her, fast. One evening, after a long conversation about dreams and what we wanted in life, I walked her home. It was a chilly night and we both shivered, but neither of us wanted to end the night. We stood outside her building, the silence stretching between us, and then she turned to me, her face a little flushed from the cold or maybe from the moment. "Are you ever scared?" she asked. "Of falling for someone?" I nodded, not sure if I was ready to admit how deep I had already fallen. "Yeah, all the time," I said softly. "But I think I'm ready to take that risk." She smiled, and it was like the whole world lit up. Weeks passed and everything just felt right. Every touch, every glance, every word felt like it was meant to be. I knew then that she was the one, but I was still unsure of how to tell her. One night at the same cafe where it all started, I looked at her and realized I couldn't wait any longer. "Nina, I started, my voice shaking slightly. "I'm in love with you?" Her eyes widened, and for a split second I thought I'd ruined everything. But then she smiled that smile, the one that made my heart stop, and said, "I've been waiting for you to say that." And in that moment, everything clicked. It wasn't just the perfect moment. It was the beginning of everything I had ever wanted. Together, we discovered love in all its forms, quiet moments, deep conversations, laughter that echoed late into the night. It wasn't perfect, but it was real and it was ours. I'm still in love with her, just like the first day we met and every day after that. Life has a way of making things complicated, but with Nina, love has always been simple, just two people deeply connected,